Hello and welcome to this Forth Valley and West Lothian supported study resource. The aim of this resource is to take you through the Modern Studies Higher revision support and help you prepare for the exam in May. The learning intentions for this resource is for you to gain an understanding of the updated advice that has been shared by the SQA so that you can prepare for the upcoming Higher Modern Studies exam, and to give you some confidence applying some of the advice from the SQA around particular questions and share good practice that you can then apply to your own revision and start to prep for your exam. Our success criteria is to listen and take note of some of the key updates so that you can understand what's required and what changes in advice have been given. For you to be able to take notes on some specific topic areas as preparation for the extended responses, and for you to consider how you can apply the SQA timing, particularly in responding to the skills questions as preparation for paper 2. So just a bit of an overview before we move forward with the resource. This resource is to work in collaboration with some of the advice that the SQA gave at the beginning of the year around in particular courses. We will look into that, but also update some of the advice that came at the start of March with the study guide resource. For modern studies, one of the things that can flag up is that we are not going to be one of the subjects that can take a short study note in with us. So on some of your subjects, it might say that you can take notes in with you to prepare. And this is just to let you know that that is unfortunately not the case for modern studies. So in terms of going into the exam, everything you need to know needs to be in your head. And a lot of that is down to the confidence that you have with the preparation that you have put in for particular tasks. So throughout this resource, you'll see some of these symbols, and that's just a little indicator of how you might use them, and just to give you a little illustration for particular tasks, and to give you a little update on perhaps something that you might want to pinpoint, something that you might want to come back to, something that gives you an indication that you could do something at this point, and that will help take forward with your revision. So the first thing obviously to make sure that everyone is aware of is when the exam actually is. So for Higher Modern Studies, our exam is Thursday the 5th of May, and both of our papers, paper 1 and paper 2, are in the morning. So paper 1 is 1 hour and 45 minutes, so that is your essay paper, your extended response paper, and then obviously you get a little half an hour break and you're back in for paper 2, which is your skills paper. And it's good to have the essays first, because then you can get all of that knowledge out of your brain ready to come in for paper 2, which is just going through a process and a technique. So all in all, 2 papers in the morning on the 5th of May. So I'm sure you're probably familiar with what the exam looks like, but what I want to do is to take a few slides to go over exactly what that looks like. And as we do that, we can pull in now some of the advice that the SQA have given us, because this might look slightly different from your prelim or any questions that you've practiced in class, because we're now using the updated advice. So paper 1 is your extended responses, your essays, and there are 3 sections. You need to answer 1 essay question from each section. Each section will have optionality, and I'll share that with you later in the resource, but you need to make sure that you have completed 1 extended response question from the democracy section, 1 extended response from the social issues section, and 1 extended response from the international section. The update that came from the SQA at the beginning of March have now told us where the 20 and 12 mark extended responses are going to be. So our political section will have the 12 mark section, and the social issues and international section will have the 20 mark section. In order to get a good score, to get that A and B that you're aspiring to, you do need to make sure that you answer all 3 questions. Don't try to put your eggs all in one basket and study just and complete just the 20 mark questions. Make sure that you do all 3. and paper 1 is at a total of 52. So before we move forward and have a little bit more of an in-depth look at the particular sections, just a little structure reminder. In order to maximise your marks for 12 mark responses, we would be looking for 3 or 4 main points. Structure is one of the things that really makes a difference at higher. At National 5, we would accept lots of little points kind of moved about, and that's not to say you can't put an asterisk or add something in, but let's try to have that structure, because that will stop you repeating points, it will stop you getting a little bit muddled up, and particularly in a 12 mark response when you're getting marks for structure, it will mean you've got your line of argument. And the one thing that's also different at higher compared to National 5 is how the marks are awarded. So at higher, there are marks for knowledge and there are marks for analysis. In both 12 and 20 marks, there are caps on your knowledge. So you can't just complete an extended response that is fully knowledge and facts. You are expected to evaluate, to link, to analyse, to expand, to comment on, to synthesise information, and that's what brings you up the analysis and evaluation marks. Particularly in a 20 mark, that extra analysis is what can really bring you up closer into the 17, 18, 19 out of 20. So as a general overview, a 12 marker would be 3 or 4 main points, and a 20 mark response would be 4 or 5 main points. And obviously that will depend on the question, that will depend on the focus of the question, what your points would be. Some might be bigger than others, but as long as you're remembering where the marks are coming from, where the caps are, where the extra marks come from, that will help you develop and expand on your points. So what I want to do is to take some time actually to go through each of these sections and just give you a little bit of an insight into where questions potentially could be sourced from, and let you navigate around that with your notes and the study guides that are available. So section 1 is Democracy in Scotland and the UK. This is the section that will have more questions to choose from in terms of optionality. So section 1 will have a choice of 4 questions. You only need to do 1. If you look on the screen, I've given an illustration from the SQA. There are 6 possible subtopics for this section. Your centre, your school, might not have studied all 6. So don't make an assumption that if you've only studied 4, that is the 4 that will come up. There is a high possibility that you could see a question which is one of the subtopics that you haven't studied. So for example, in my centre, I haven't taught the effectiveness of parliament representatives in holding government to account, but that question could still be there. So don't assume that all of the questions that you've studied in your centre will come up. Don't put your eggs all in one basket and only study 1 or 2 in the hope that they'll come up. However many your centre has taught, that's how many you should revise. There might well be ones you know better than others and you're more confident with. That's absolutely natural. But even though there is a choice of 4 questions, just remember your options might be limited in the sense that your centre might not have studied all of them in the first place. Okay, but this is the one where there's just that little bit more optionality. You can scroll down the 4. Hopefully there are 1 or 2 that you feel great with, and then that gives you confidence that you're starting off the paper with one that you really know. So in terms of section 1, this is going to be our 12 marker. 2 of those 4 questions will be analyse questions. 2 of the 4 will be evaluate. Analyse and evaluation are very similar, but both types of questions are effectively asking you to look at alternatives, so not just one factor. They would be expecting you to compare 2 things together or link certain things together and make a judgment. So if you're asked to analyse whether a voting system leads to fair representation, you must make a judgment at the end about whether it did actually lead to fair representation or not. On the screen, I have put in a QR code that links to the 2017 SQA paper that has to evaluate political questions, so that if you want to see what that looks like, these are 12 markers, so that's very similar to where perhaps questions might come from for this year, so that you can have a little bit of practice on them. So at this point, to help you start to prepare for the political section on the 12 marker, I have put up a learner task, and it might be at this point that you want to pause and you want to have a look through your political notes and start to think about how you might pull your knowledge together. So for each of the topic areas that you've studied, I have put together a mind map with a suggestion that you complete the mind map to summarise the main points. So the bubbles would be your paragraphs. Remember, in a 12 marker, we're looking for 3 or 4 points. So for example, in the middle, the topic area, the voting influences, you would be looking to fill up your bubble with voting influences that you have looked at. So for example, you might have looked at social class, you might have looked at forms of media, you might have looked at age, and this is where you can start to pull your notes and perhaps expand on your mind map, put a little bit of detail, add in some explanation and some examples. At this point, if you're looking at your mind map and you've got a gap, don't worry about it. That gives us something to work with. It gives us something to review. There are resources linked further down in this video that might give you a route to being able to fill some of them out. If there is a bullet point that you haven't studied, well then, of course, don't make a mind map of it. Remember, the whole point of the SQA given us a little bit of guidance towards this is so that we can streamline some of our revision. So for each of the bullet points that you've done, I would suggest that you create the mind map, and I would estimate that this would take about half an hour, 40 minutes for all of the topics that you've studied. And when you're ready, you can pick up on the next part of the video. Okay, so section 2 is social issues in the UK. There is optionality here because different centres will have studied different topics. So again, be sure to answer the topic that your centre has studied. It might be you have looked at social inequality, which is to do with health and wealth, which will be the first 3 questions to A, to B, to C. If you have studied crime and the law, then you are the second set of 3 questions, which is 2D, 2E and 2F. You have a choice of 3. Remember, you only need to study 1. Again, if you look at the illustration from the SQA, each of these subtopics have 5 points. It might well be that your centre has not looked at every single bullet point. So again, don't assume that all 3 that you have completed will be the 3 that have come up. And don't look at the 3 or 4 that you've done and decide you're only going to study 1. Okay, because remember, every centre has approached things differently. There is a range of questions within the 3, and hopefully that will play to your strength. But be wary of making a decision that you're only going to study, for example, the causes of, and you're not going to look at anything else, because you could be disappointed if that doesn't come up, because there are other bullet points available. So just be really mindful of putting all your eggs in one basket. So in this section here, the SQA have told us that our 20 markers will be discuss questions, and there will be 3 of these. So one of the things to look out for is often in a 20 marker, we get what we call an isolated factor. So often they will give you one factor or one cause that they want you to talk about to begin with, and the subsequent points that you bring in link into that, and that's how you get your line of argument. So this is the one that came up in the 2017 paper, which is poverty is the main cause of poor health, or poverty is the main cause of health. Your first paragraph, your first point, should be looking at poverty and discussing the story around poverty being the main cause of poor health, poverty being the main cause of crime. But obviously poverty is not the only cause. So your subsequent paragraph should bring in other causes of poor health, other causes of crime. And you are expected to make a link between your other causes. Is poverty greater or less significant? And start to kind of build up that line of argument. Make sure that in your discuss question that you are linking them. Don't have them standing alone, because often what you'll find is that factors are actually interlinked. Again, I've just given a little link to the 2017 paper in the QR code, so that if you want to click into that and have a look at the marking instruction to see what other causes, other points might be included, and just to get a little illustration of what the analysis might look like in terms of that discussion. Again, at this point, I've put together a learner task that will help you pull together your notes and your revision for the social issues. Looking at the bullet points that the SQA have provided, again, it might be worthwhile at this point creating a structure, particularly for a 20-mark extended response. It's really important that you pull together the main points so that you can start to see what ones interlink, or you can start to consider which ones would rank higher or less. Important. Remember, you don't know the exact wording of the question. You don't know the emphasis it's going to be put on. We're not looking to go in with a pre-rehearsed essay. We're looking to go in with you being confident with your knowledge that you can apply it and move them about depending on what the emphasis of the question is about. So again, it might be useful for you to look at the subtopics on the left-hand side and pull together a mind map that has that development and has those examples, and then you can cross-reference with past paper questions and have a look about how that all fits in. So I would estimate that, again, that would take between 35 and 40 minutes for you to do that. And when you're ready, you can pick up and flex in to get some hints and tips on the final section, international issues. So our final section is international issues. Again, we have been told this is where a 20 marker is going to be. And again, there will be a choice of 3 questions. So if you study world powers, first 3 questions. If you study world issues, it's the second set of questions. The one thing to be clear about here is that the question will not specifically mention your world power or your world issue, because different schools study different topics. A little tip that I always give to my learners is actually to score world power or world issue in the question out and write yours at the top so that the question flows. So to what extent does China allow political opportunities, or to what extent is it effective in tackling terrorism? And that way the question just flows that little bit easier. Again, and I know I sound like I'm repeating myself, don't assume that all of the subtopics that you've studied will be the ones that will appear in that optionality. You can see there are 5 subtopics for each one. You know, that's a lot of content, and often schools will put points together or they'll streamline things. So again, be careful that you don't just say, that's the one I'm going to study, because it might not come up. Okay, there has to be an element of unseen, because that's the whole point of an external examination. But again, make sure you only study one, and make sure you study it from the topic that you actually do. And be really clear about which world power it is that you've studied. So if you do China, or you do the USA, or you're studying terrorism or development in Africa, make sure you do make reference to that, because sometimes it is actually difficult to work out unless you label it up and make it really explicit. So in terms of navigating section 3, we know that it is going to be to what extent. So these are questions that ask you to compare factors in relation to each other. So they are actually asking you to make a judgment. They're asking you to comment to a large extent or to a small extent whether something is important or not. I've put up the 2018 SQA past paper because it has examples of 20 mark to what extent questions in the international section. To what extent does social economic inequality exist in a world power you've studied? To what extent are some factors which cause this issue more important than others. And again, that'll let you see what factors, or let you see the analysis, because the past paper marking instructions have sample paragraphs that you can have a look at. Again, one of the things that we are trying to work with is our structure, particularly in a 20 marker. That's often where candidates fall down because their line of argument gets a little bit weak. So we're looking to pull up our knowledge, we're looking to bring in together our mind map so that we can develop, so that we can see what points go where, avoid repetition of analysis, because that is something that is often quite common. People will say, this shows this is a great inequality. This shows it's not a great inequality. We're looking to be a little bit more sophisticated. We're looking to bring up a little bit more of a judgment. In relation to factors, for example, this shows health is a greater influence on inequality compared to education. We're looking for you to actually have that relation of factors. So again, using the illustration from the SQA, using the bullet points that they've got, creating a mind map, pulling your knowledge together so that we can see where the gaps are. So paper 2 is 1 hour and 20 minutes, and this is where we can do a lot of preparation in terms of our skills questions, because we know exactly what skills questions are going to appear, we know what marks they're worth, and we can practice the technique. If you are aspiring to be an A or a B candidate, your skills questions are really where you can make the difference here, because there's an element there of preparation. We have one conclusion skills question, one accuracy question, and one reliability question. And that's the order that they will appear in. Your conclusions will be first, then your accuracy, then your reliability. Try to stick to the 2 minutes per mark, because that will make sure that you get through all of the skills questions in the time, and that will bring us close to our total of 28. So in terms of paper 2, this is where we use only the structure and the technique. We don't need any background knowledge at all, and in fact you won't be credited for any background knowledge that you bring in. If you've looked at past paper questions, you'll often see that the focus of the question is not on a topic that you've studied. And don't panic about that, because it's the skill that we use. And any key terminology that needs to be explained will be explained up on the first source. But even if you weren't too sure what it was talking about, don't worry about that. In some ways, you can get through the question without needing to fully understand it, because you use the skill and you bring that in, and that helps you open up the marks. The structure is different from every question, and that is the one thing at higher we would expect you to get on point. And at higher, the marks for the skills questions are perhaps just a little bit tighter than they would have been at National 5, because there are a couple of things that you need to do, and that's about following instructions. So question number 1 is our conclusions question, and this is where you are given 3 bullet points and you are asked to draw a conclusion about each of the bullet points. Each bullet point is a paragraph, and I would always advise go and look at the wording of the bullet points first. There's no point looking at the source if you don't know what you're looking for, because you haven't looked at the wording of the bullet point. Once you've looked at the wording of the bullet point, you can then scan the sources to draw your attention to the key words and let that guide you to what you're saying. A conclusion is an observation about what you see happening. So is something changing? Is something increasing or decreasing? Is it staying the same? State what you see happening. Then you go and use the evidence from the source to support that judgment. Don't use the evidence from the sources to begin with, because if you haven't stated your conclusion, then you won't get any marks. Doesn't matter if you've got the correct evidence. If you've not stated a conclusion somewhere in that opening paragraph, you're not going to get the marks. And that's where higher is just that little bit tighter. So in terms of top tips, state your conclusion. What do you see happening in relation to the bullet point? Use 2 pieces of source evidence, maybe more, but a minimum of 2 pieces of evidence for each bullet point from across the sources, within the sources. You can absolutely use something from the same source twice if it is a different feature of the source. If you are using figures and you want to comment on the difference between the figures, then absolutely go ahead and do that. and repeat that process for the remaining 2 bullet points. The final thing to remember is that you are asked to draw an overall conclusion about, and there will be a different focus. Make sure that you don't forget to draw the overall conclusion. Actually, often what I get my learners to do is to put a little bullet point next to that so that they remember to do it, because you are capped at 8 out of 10 if you don't do the final conclusion. Try not to repeat evidence, because evidence usually matches up to separate bullet points. Our next skills question is our accuracy question, and this is where we're given a statement which will always start with to what extent is it accurate to state, and you have to find evidence from the sources to suggest that it is accurate, that something is correct, but you also have to find evidence from the source to show that something is not correct. There's no set layout in terms of there have to be so many pieces to support and so many pieces to oppose, because that will depend on the source. You have to read that, you have to make a judgment. It's not about the quantity of evidence, it's about the quality of evidence that you pull. So you don't have to find equal amounts for both sides. What I would suggest is that you put all of your evidence to support the statement in one paragraph, and then you put all of your evidence to disagree, oppose in another paragraph. Your overall conclusion must answer the question, to what extent? Don't say to a certain extent, that will cap you with the marks. You have either found to a large extent the statement is correct, or you, to a small extent, have found that it's incorrect. If you say that it is wholly accurate or wholly inaccurate, you won't get any marks. Because to what extent implies that there are 2 sides of the coin, and you have looked at 2 sides of the coin by pulling different bits of information. So make sure that in your overall conclusion you do actually make a judgment to a large or to a small extent. Our final question is our reliability, and this is where you're given 3 individual sources, source A, B and C. And you are being asked to identify features of the source that make them reliable or unreliable. Deal with them one source at a time. Look at source A, and you're looking to pick out 2 features for each source or 1 developed feature. So if you're looking at source A and you see something about the date, does that make it useful or not? If you see something about a sample size, does that make it useful or not? You're not getting the mark for commenting on the date. You're getting your mark for your justification about why the date makes it reliable or unreliable. So if you say it was written in 2014 and it's out of date, you're not going to get any marks for that. Your mark comes from it's out of date, therefore it makes it not relevant and not applicable to the issue that we're exploring, for example. If you pick out that it is a bias source, you're not getting the mark for bias, you're getting the mark for your judgment about why bias would make it unreliable. So it's that justification. And you repeat that process for source B and for source C. Again, we've got a conclusion. We are capped at 6 out of 8 if we don't have our conclusion. You need to state which of the 3 sources you have found to be the most useful. Was it source A, B or C? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's your justification. So if you said source A was reliable because it had the most neutral source and it wasn't biased, that's fine. You must say why you didn't choose B and C. I didn't choose B and C because they were from biased sources of political parties who'd be pushing their own agenda, for example. Okay, so you get 1 mark for saying why you chose that particular source to be reliable, and the other mark comes from saying why you didn't choose the other 2. A little top tip, try not to pick out the same feature for every source, and actually often that is not there in every source to prevent you from doing that. But if the date is there on them all, don't use the same comment for them all, because although you're looking at them individually, it's not really expanding your skill. So try to pick out a different feature, and remember your mark comes from your further comment, your judgment about why that particular feature is reliable or not. And in the conclusion, make sure you actually make a judgment about which one is the best. Don't say they all have features that make them reliable or unreliable. You don't sit on the fence, actually be specific. So you've done really well, you've come this far. Obviously, this is a whistle-stop tour, and this is an overview of a higher course that you have been working on since the start of the summer term. The good thing about this resource is that you can go backward and forward, you can flip to sections that you want to have another relook at, you can listen to the audio again, you can scan the QR codes, and that'll take you to various places to help you fill in any gaps. If you're at the point now where you're feeling confident, you might want to start thinking about bringing in some of the time frame. And the skills questions are one of the things that are really good to practice within the time frame, because that's the one thing we can't change, which is the timing. But we know we're going to have our skills questions. We know we can practice the technique, and that's one way where we can really kind of speed up and make sure we're confident. And particularly remembering the little hints and tips of where the marks come from. So if we get these things right, we know that that's going to make a big difference and is going to give us a quarter of our marks. So if you're at the point now where you feel ready, you might want to scan the QR code, which takes you to the 2019 past paper, which is the last available paper on the SQA website, and have a go at the conclusions, the accuracy and the reliability question. And you can also use the QR code to access the marking instructions and do a little bit of self-assessment as well. So a couple of our little things that are available for you. We do have the BBC Bitesize page for higher modern studies that breaks down the different sections, and there's little self-assessment tests on there as well, little quick fire things. If you want to break down and have a look at a particular topic again, then you can access the West OS videos. You can do it from your Glow Launchpad, or you can scan the QR code. There are lots of 10-minute videos that have been made by other more studies practitioners. I've got a few on there for China. They are really good little videos. They're 10 minutes long, and they have little tasks in amongst them as well. So if you wanted to go back and revisit a bit of content, if you weren't in school or you weren't sure and you want to go back and have a little look, they're really useful because, again, you can pause them and replay them. So next steps as we work between now and May and you pull your revision schedule together is to obviously bear in mind the updates that the SQA have given us, to think about where the 12 and 20 markers are, to think about those little hints and tips and good practice so that you know what content goes with each question, where we're maximising the marks, making sure we know where questions are coming from, working out what our structure is so that we can then revise from that and really getting it clear in your head. What does it look like? What am I required to do? What do my notes show? And once you've got to that point, that's when you can start to bring a little bit of the timing in. And you don't have to do the timing in one big go. You don't have to sit down and do a big past paper. Sometimes it's just useful to put a little timer on for each individual question and see what you can achieve. And if you're feeling like you want to push that a little bit further, there are access to all of the past paper questions on the SQA website within that little QR code. This is a resource you can come back to, you can replay several times, and you can use that to fill in any gaps. And I wish you the best of luck for Thursday the 5th of May, and I'm absolutely sure that you will smash it.